Introduction. Going by the discussion we just had above, it is observed that neuroeconomics has been successful in giving birth to a group of different choice models which are separate but individually drawn and forms a part of economics itself. Beyond its potential for refining economic theories, a better understanding of the neural processes underlying behavior could have other far-reaching consequences. For example, economists have typically assumed an equivalence between preference and welfare, i.e., that satisfying people's preferences will make them better offer. Neuroscience methods also hold out the promise of making it possible to measure happiness more directly, or at least mechanisms more proximal to the experience of happiness that may show up a deep impact on public policy making. Currently, it is widely believed that it is impossible to make interpersonal comparisons of desire or well-being. Deprived of such data, economists have been very reluctant to take a strong position on issues of resource distribution. Person A may have 10 times as much wealth as person B, which might lead one to assume that person B would benefit more than person A would be hurt by a transfer or wealth from A to B. However, lacking any ability to compare the two individuals' utilities, such an inference would be logically unsound. Perhaps person A has a much greater appreciation of luxury than B, so that overall happiness would actually be enhanced by a further transfer of wealth from B to A. Neuroscientific measurement of hedonic states might help to disarm such logical defenses of inequality. Looking ahead, neuroeconomics will continue to capitalize on the latest technologies developed by neuroscientists. Ideally, the technology will become increasingly portable. Critics of laboratory research often lament the alien-like, context-free nature of experiments. Studies in which participants must remain almost perfectly still inside multi-ton magnets are even more vulnerable to such critiques. Finally, the combination of multiple methods will undoubtedly lead to new insights. Its promise is great, in part because 50 years of dominance by the rational choice model has left so many important questions unanswered. What, for example, is the enormous appeal of gambling? Why are disputes, whether between individuals or countries, so often jointly destructive? What causes the boom and bust cycles that are so clearly present in financial and other markets? How does advertising work? Why do credit cards promote spending? Why do people fail to save for retirement? A refined understanding of human behavior has the potential to shed light on these and many other important phenomena, and a better understanding of neural processing, in turn, cannot help but inform our understanding of human behavior. Shut the fuck up, stimmislimas stvarno. Chapter 1. Social Decision-Making. Even though existence of some widely accepted benchmark is in place for some risky decision-making and intertemporal option, but there is almost nothing of that sort which will discreetly state how people should react and behave with each other. To adhere to the belief that people are purely selfish would not only require that one ignores wide-ranging experimental results showing the contrary, but may clash, as is commonly observed almost everywhere. The experimental research on other regarding behavior not only demonstrates that people care about the welfare of others, but also challenges the validity of some of the most oldest systems of social likings, for e.g., those that assume that social preferences can be captured by a function that puts a fixed welfare, well-being. Neuroeconomists and standard economists debate whether welfare is synonymous with objective happiness or, behaviorally, revealed preferences weight on the welfare of other persons. Although in some cases, e.g. parents toward children, there may be an element of altruism that could potentially be modelled in this fashion, more generally people tend to care about their own salary and payments, and either the difference between others and their own salary and payments, or the difference between their own actual payment with that of what they conceive as ideal. Although models of this type take major strides in the direction of providing a more realistic account of other regarding preferences, once again they leave some important aspects of this observed phenomenon. In some cases, such as crying in a movie, we can be deeply moved by people who do not warrant sympathy, even fictional movie characters who do not actually exist. Different cases like that of mass calamity occurring at very far-off places in the world doesn't even touch people's heart anymore these days if we realize at an intellectual level that those victims are highly deserving of our sympathy and aid. To capture these phenomena, as well as a variety of experimental findings, Lowenstein and Small have proposed a dual-process model. The neuroeconomics literature is, in this case, highly supportive of such a perspective overall, although, as discussed below, some of the major findings seem somewhat contradictory. For example, some research has suggested that self-interest sometimes relies on deliberate and possibly even deliberative suppression of our more emotional wishes for goodness, whereas other work has suggested that self-interest is the more evolutionary primitive desire that is sometimes suppressed by fairness concerns. Below, we examine the relevant evidence as well as other neuroeconomic research on social preferences. Reviews. Some recent research has suggested that conflicts between affect and deliberation are particularly likely when people face certain moral dilemmas. Consider, for example, one of the classic trolley dilemmas, in which a runaway trolley is headed for 5 people who will be killed if it continues in the same style as it is at present. A very similar dilemma at the footbridge, where some trolley appears to kill 5 people. To investigate whether personal moral dilemmas that require the direct infliction of harm to achieve a greater utilitarian good elicit more intense emotional responses. Participants also faced several non-normal dilemmas that required a similar degree of mental effort, as judged by reaction times. As predicted, brain regions consistently associated with emotional processing, such as medial frontal and posterior paracingulate cortex, were more active when participants considered personal moral dilemmas. The notion which says that emotions have a big role to play when it comes to moral and personal dilemmas by Green found that participants took significantly longer to make utilitarian judgments that went against the emotional response in the personal moral dilemmas than to come up with the confusing and very similar judgments. Results of this act clearly shows that the personal moral dilemmas elicit a strong prepotent emotional response that must be cognitively overcome in order to respond in a manner not going with the internal thoughts or emotions. Given that patients with VMPFC lessons typically show diminished emotional responsivity in general and severely reduced social emotions, e.g. shame, in particular, these participants were predicted to find utilitarian judgments more palatable in the personal moral dilemmas as compared with normal and lesion control participants. For sure, Koenigs found that the frequency of utilitarian judgments did not differ by participant type in the non-moral and impersonal moral conditions, but that participants with VMPFC lesions were most likely to make utilitarian judgments in the personal moral condition. Generally, these types of dilemmas, which are based on morality, are evaluated a bit too deliberatively, e.g. which choice will lead to fewer people dying, and effectively, which choice would feel worse. Since the deliberative element is intentionally kept constant across the dilemmas, whereas the affective element differs, people with emotion deficiencies, who evaluate all of the dilemmas deliberatively, make decisions that are more consistent. Another context in which affect and deliberation appear to conflict is that of the Ultimatum Game. These results are typically obtained in one-shot games, meaning responders' unwillingness to accept small offers cannot be interpreted as an attempt to elicit larger offers in the future. Also, participants typically play the game anonymously, so the results cannot be attributed to immediate reputational or self-presentation concerns. Several behavioral economic models have emerged to account for such findings. Reciprocity-based theories of fairness, for example, propose that people enjoy reciprocating intentional kindness with kindness and intentional unkindness with unkindness. Inequality aversion models propose that people are averse to outcomes that deviate from equality, whether that inequality is disadvantageous or advantageous. Participants in their study all responders were told they would play the Ultimatum Game with 10 different human proposers, though offers were actually predetermined by the ones who were conducting the experiments. Many of the participants received the same offer, but this time from a computer, although what it means to receive an offer from a computer is somewhat ambiguous, given that the computer cannot literally keep the residual money. Consistent with intention-based theories of reciprocity and behavioral work by Blount, participants were more willing to accept low offers from computer proposers than that of the proposers who are humans. Moreover, activation in the anterior insula, an emotional region of the cortical pain matrix, was greater in response to unfair offers from human proposers than in response to some sort of offers that are certainly not fair from the computer supporting group. The insular findings thus appear to support the inequality aversion models. Responders appear to be rejecting offers not because they enjoy reciprocating unkindness with all forms of kindness. Chapter 2. Effects of Neuroeconomics. In any workforce, the managers and employees are the most important part of the system. In order to take out the best out of any workforce, its managers are constantly trying out different strategies and methods which can have a direct positive impact in their productivity and the economy as a whole. Employee engagement studied in the light of neuroscientific researches and with the help of neuroeconomics principles has a long-term effect which can no more be undermined. For that, research is done on the substance called oxytocin, a chemical secreted by the brain to develop an enhanced framework for building up a loyal, happier and more productive workforce which increases teamwork and facilitates collaboration at all levels for maximum output. My question is directed towards that of the topic Recognize Excellence, which is a behavior within that framework. In your research, did you run into any issues with what was recognized? Was it the accomplishment or the effort? Recognition of an accomplishment, rather than the hard work that achieved it, is counter to enriching trust on teams, in my experience. This can be seen every year when the annual performance review cycle begins. Cooperation and collaboration turn to competition. Michael De Paoli, CEO, Factual Consulting, the author, responds. In my Scribd Trust Factor, I argue that the best way to set expectations for excellence is to focus on outcomes, not presenteeism. Combining goals with constant feedback from supervisors creates a tight learning loop in the brain that reinforces excellence. Supervisors should serve as coaches, and the attainment of goals should be celebrated immediately, not just during annual reviews. The brain works just like a muscle. It's best to set hard but achievable objectives, let colleagues rest for a few days after reaching them, and then start again with a new challenge. Neuroscience studies help us understand the complexity of the brain and human nature, but often they simply validate things we already know. Trust is a complex emotion, and I didn't actually see the author define it as the concept being researched. I'd be interested in his definition of trust. An aspect that especially interests me is the one that Charles M. Schulz illustrated in his famous cartoons of Lucy pulling the football out from under Charlie Brown. What makes Charlie Brown think that this time it will be different? What about Lucy gets him to keep trying despite the fact that she can't be trusted? Sarah Jacobovici, owner Creative Arts Therapy Services. I can't disagree with Zach's conclusions about trust in business. However, his approach to getting there is unnecessarily complex. Zach quite correctly pinpoints the fundamentally reciprocal nature of trust. One party takes a risk, and the other party then reveals itself as trustworthy or not. This is a critical observation, but is common sense. It's not something we need neuroscience to prove. If you accept that trust is reciprocal, then 7 of Zach's 8 behaviors are self-evident. Recognize excellence, give people discretion in how they do work. Each involves either overtly taking a risk on the other person or showing vulnerability. In fact, the only strategy that isn't obviously linked to reciprocity is induce challenge stress. We don't need neuroscience to justify, explain, or deduce any of these behaviors. I've researched trust for 8 years and developed a quantitative measurement of organizational trustworthiness in public companies, and I'm having a difficult time linking the author's statement that oxytocin causes trust with the 8 suggested strategies on how to achieve it. I've been interested in trust in the context of cross-sector collaboration or partnerships for some time, and I've found research that categorizes it in 2 types. First, affect-based trust, which develops from emotional bonds and positive feelings toward individuals based on the belief that another's intentions are good. I trust my mother. And second, cognition-based trust, which comes from evidence of trustworthiness and is often built through interactions with or impressions of an organization. The focus of this trust is reliance on an organization's practices rather than the individuals within the organization to produce a good outcome. I trust Honda cars. So it seems that trust can be defined both by how it's created and by our proximity to the person or organization we trust. Brad Henderson, Lead Corporate and Foundation Relations, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, as an entrepreneur. I've seen a lack of trust between our investors and our executive team damage our company. I plan on following the article's suggestions for building trust with all our stakeholders. Competition in healthcare is must. Competition in healthcare won't be a panacea because of the geographic nature of the product. Price will move some but not all, and I suspect that if convenient providers are not the most cost-effective, many will simply forego routine care. Charles Mendelsohn, acupuncturist, West Seattle Concierge Acupuncture. The absence of value in healthcare is rooted in 5 decades of price controls. Has not history screamed for centuries that price controls never produce value but do pervert behavior and neutralize the balancing forces of a competitive market, leading to inflation, poor quality, surpluses, scarcity, fraud, waste, organized crime, and so on? In a competitive market, value is constantly reshaped by innovations in an evolution which continues endlessly, but towards perfection. When a government or third-party pair wants to reward value, it needs to define it, and to define it is to stagnate it, making it average or worse, never allowing it to be what it could be. The buyer of the first Lexus sold paid for its value. The price was not subjectively awarded after a period of driving. It reflected an innovative workforce, actual achievements. To achieve mass acceptance of global or bundled price controls in healthcare delivery, third-party pairs will have to be willing to pay for value based on historical financial and patient data. R. Daniel King, retired president and CEO Medical of St. Louis. I can't help comparing the healthcare system to airlines. Under the current healthcare payment model, it's as if you fly from JFK to LAX and then pay the airline. Price transparency will do wonders. Knowing the price up front will drive behavior. Chapter 3. Impact of Neuroscience. One of the goals of brain imaging research is to identify causal links between brain structure and behavior. Trauma. For more than a century, authors interested in the impact of brain trauma on behavior have, of necessity, cited the remarkable case of Phineas Gage. Gage was a worker for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad in New England, where he was considered reliable and intelligent. In September 1848, a lapse in concentration saw him attempt to pack down the explosive before a protective layer of sand had been added. Whether or not it would be fair to say he survived the accident is a moot point. His persona was radically altered after the event. Although he seemed to have retained his intelligence, speech abilities and physical coordination, he now had no regard for social conventions. He was prone to swearing, irresponsible and untrustworthy. The company had to let him go. Gage eventually died in the 1860s. No autopsy was conducted at the time, but his skull was later recovered and ultimately became the property of Harvard University. Although there is general consensus that the left frontal lobe was destroyed in the accident, authors differ in their speculations regarding the additional regions which were harmed. It was noted that the existence of the so-called readiness potential was more important to the current discussion than the exact location of that signal within the brain. A more recent case is rapidly becoming as notorious as Phineas Gage when considering the psychological impact of physical damage to the brain. When the latter reported this to her mother, the man's other activities came to light and he was offered either a residential therapy program or a prison sentence. He chose the therapeutic alternative but was expelled from the center after making sexual advances at female staff members, making a jail term his only option. On the evening prior to transfer to prison, the man complained of a severe headache and was taken to hospital. Given the circumstances, i.e. imminent incarceration, the doctors suspected the cause of his headache to be psychological rather than physiological. However, the following morning, the man also reported balance difficulties and was sent for magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, of his brain. Somewhat unexpectedly, the MRI scan revealed a tumor in the orbifrontal cortex, an area of the brain known to be involved in regulation of social behavior. Some while later, he developed a persistent headache. He also began to covertly collect pornographic images again. Further, MRI demonstrated that the tumor had regrown. At the time of his case report, the man was no longer prone to deviant sexual behavior. Atrophy, with an ever-aging population, neurodegenerative disorders such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease are becoming increasingly common. One of the very common symptoms which is observed under these conditions is primary loss of memory. However, in the context of our present discussion, it is worth noting that behavioral changes can also emerge. As areas of brain tissue die away, other symptoms can include the emergence of antisocial behavior, such as sexual disinhibition and increased aggression. Men carrying the abnormal Huntington's disease gene are disproportionately likely to be involved in criminal behavior. So, what impact might genetic or neurological abnormalities have had on the behavior of defendants in criminal trials? In the next chapter, we will review some of the existing cases in which attempts have been made to introduce neuroscientific and genetic evidence. Chapter 4. Formation of Neuroeconomics. He was minding his own business, or so he thought. It had been a hard day, beginning with an early morning rescue operation to locate several of the flock that had wandered off. Unfortunately, one of the missing sheep had fallen into a ravine, requiring a slaughter he hadn't counted on. Late in the afternoon, a driving dust storm had threatened to scatter all the animals again. As he led them around to the north side of the mountain to more plentiful grazing areas, he had to pause often to count the sheep. It happened just after the chaos of the storm. At first, he thought it might have been because of his hunger or thirst. Maybe it was due to the sweltering heat. Perhaps it was the result of fatigue and the monotony of his job. But the man could swear he was seeing something he'd never seen before. Something you just don't see every day in the desert. And he had been in the desert a long time. He knew others who had seen things that weren't really there when they had become too thirsty. Was that what he was experiencing? There was only one way to find out. He would move in closer to investigate. He walked a few paces and blinked his eyes. His impression didn't change. It was still there. Flame billowed all around and through the dark, tree-like shrub. Yet the bush itself was not burning, even though at this time of year it was exceptionally dry. If set ablaze, it would be consumed in minutes, which was why he now was fully aware of the strangeness of what he was witnessing. This shepherd has seen plenty of brush fires in his day, usually caused by lightning. This was something different. The small shrubbery refused to give in to the heat. It didn't char, and there was no smoke. He was puzzled and fixated, drawn and captivated. It was the voice that undid him. Seeing things was one thing. Hearing a voice coming from the flame he wasn't certain was really there was too much. But it was the simple act of paying attention to something unusual in an otherwise bland landscape that would change the life of Moses forever. You may be familiar with this biblical story from Exodus 3. It is an intriguing account of a man who had been on the run from the world in which he grew up, on the run from Pharaoh, and of the run from himself. Only on the far side of the desert was his attention awakened to things within and without him. There, at the edge of the world, he paid attention to the voice that spoke to him in a dialect like none he had ever heard. His life likely would have remained the same had he not paid attention. Had he not paid attention, he would have missed the opportunity to go over and see this strange sight. Stories about in Scripture of people whose first step toward growth came as they paid attention to God's calling. Adam, Eve, Cain, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Moses, Gideon, Deborah, Samuel, David, Mary, Joseph, wise astronomers, Jesus, Paul. From Genesis through Acts, the Bible weaves a rich tapestry of narratives describing people's response to God's initiative. Furthermore, the way the biblical characters choose to pay attention had significant, sometimes life-threatening consequences. But what were they paying attention to that convinced them they were hearing from God? How do they know the words weren't just the product of indigestion, a fight with their parents or spouses, or just wishful thinking? I know I'd be a lot more open to the thought that God had told me to pack up my wife and children and move to Colorado if my extended family was getting on my nerves and I really liked the mountains. What they paid attention to affected their lives, or even more likely, in the spirit of the new neurospirituality articulated by Andrew Newberg, How God Changes Your Brain, and George Vaillant, Spiritual Evolution, some would interpret these experiences as mere reflections of particular neuron firing patterns unrelated to any real agent outside themselves. It's easy for us in our modern and postmodern ways of thinking to simply assume that these folks connected with God in a special way that is unavailable to us. Some people casually dismiss these stories outright, reducing the word of the Lord to imaginative, primitive thinking on the part of ancient writers who, though well-intended, really didn't know that much about the way the world works. If you haven't read the accounts of some of these heroes of the faith lately, it would be good to review them. Consider how and to what they paid attention. In Moses' case, we are not surprised that he paid attention. Who wouldn't have? It was a burning bush, for crying out loud. But the biblical account reveals that Moses actually regarded the bush. After he had attended to this natural phenomenon, he pondered his response. I suspect that God really enjoys the attention that he gets from us. The degree to which we pay attention to him affects not only us, it affects him. God was pleased enough that Moses was paying attention to him that he went further than lighting a botanical candle. He decided to talk with him. When God talks and we attentively listen, wonderful, beautiful, terrifying things happen. From the viewpoint of neuroscience, what does it mean for us to pay attention? And how does paying attention affect all of our relationships, not least the one we have with Jesus? Chapter 5. Recent Developments. If it was established that the science of behavior could be accurately described via the study of neuroscience and genetics, it would not necessarily follow that this, if used as an evidence, could be used effectively in the legal system. However, if the science was shown to be fundamentally flawed, it would argue strongly against its use in the context of criminal justice. The kinds of research being conducted to investigate the biological basis of behavior have been discussed at length in Chapter 3. Here we examine specifically issues regarding the validity and reliability of this data, considering, in turn, the brain imaging and the genetic approaches. Over the past century, a variety of approaches to brain imaging have been developed. It remains, of course, possible to abuse a scientifically robust technique by misapplication of the data generated, and some controversy persists regarding the legal application of EEG-generated evidence as an assessment of incriminating memories. The method itself is nevertheless considered reliable. Processing of information by the brain needs energy, and the flow of blood bringing oxygen to the site serves a second-hand report of the action. Clearly, this is not ideal. We would like to be able to see the nerve cells directly rather than measuring blood oxygen level dependent variation. It is also important to note that dependency on secondary signals to obtain information about scientific process is not an issue unique to fMRI. The simple image-like brain scans completely undermines the enormous data processing that has been employed to reach that point. Rescans then occur every 1 to 3 seconds, possibly for as long as an hour in total. That's a lot of data points. With so many readings at such a large number of voxels, it is inevitable that random fluctuations will occur. This actually means, in any typical study, 50 to 100 voxels are randomly activated stuff and potentially miscounted as exhibiting a genuine response. Evidently, these could not be detecting genuine behavior. They must have been random changes. Nevertheless, what had started out as a joke in fact turned into an important lesson about conducting the appropriate safeguards. There are, however, other statistical errors that have been more persistent in the literature. Wall conducted a systematic review of 53 published papers linking regions of the brain to behavioral traits. A first pass of the data was used to select interesting voxels for further study. The researchers then conducted a secondary analysis of the same data pertaining to those selected regions in order to quantify the difference in activation. They were therefore measuring correlation in areas where they have already decided there is correlation. Conclusion. I will conclude by turning to the issue of biological value. Neuroscience has identified several chemical molecules that are, in one way or another, associated with value: dopamine, cortisol, oxytocin, and prolactin. Neuroscience has also identified a number of subcortical neuron nuclei located in the brainstem and hypothalamus, which manufacture those molecules and deliver all of them to specified parts of the body as well as the brain. Value is undeniably tied to need, and need is tied to life. The valuations we establish in everyday social and cultural activities have a direct or indirect connection with human biology, and in particular with the processes of life regulation known by the term homeostasis. Value relates directly or indirectly to survival. Because survival means different things in the perspectives of genes, cells, systems, whole organisms and cultures, the origins of value will appear to be different. Accordingly, I regard the physiological state of tissues within a living organism, specifically the state of living tissue within a homeostatic range, as the deepest origin of biological value and valuations. One homeostatic range has high risk of all diseases and death with a scope of living cells reducing, and on other homeostatic range, living tissue flourishes and its function becomes more efficient and economic. States closer to the former extreme are less valuable than states in the middle range and states closer to the latter extreme. The primitive of organism value is inscribed in the psychological parameters of the state itself. The values attributed to objects and activities will bear some relation, no matter how indirect or remote, to the maintenance of living tissue within a homeostatic range. As noted, the neurobiology literature tends to be vague regarding the issue of value. Value is still defined in terms of a psychological state. However, it is reasonable to wonder how the conditions described for cells and organisms come to be. To approach such an issue, we must consider events that took place in a long ago evolutionary past, a reverse form of engineering that is never easy. We can begin by considering that, in order to continue their existence over generations, gene networks needed to construct perishable, complex, and some of those living creatures with specific directions. My hypothesis is that a good part of those fundamental instructions ended up constructing devices capable of conducting general life regulations, homeostasis, distributing rewards, applying punishments, and helping predict the next situation of an organism. In brief, devices capable of executing what we have come to call the feelings as emotions, broadly speaking. Possibly the very first time these sketches were ever tested was perhaps on the most primitive organisms in the early stages of evolution who lacked consciousness or even mind in the absence of a developed brain, but since then the devices which regulated everything reached a level of greater complexity in organisms that do have all three: mind, consciousness and brain. I suspect the empowering instructions were an important engine early in evolution, and everything suggests that they are still in use today from the level of operations. Not only can we learn a lot about what makes us human by studying the anatomy of the brain, we acquire additional insights from considering its various systems, including the economics. Systems cut across regions and involve multiple levels of the brain, often within both the right and left hemispheres. Additional systems regulate fear, stress, and our level of engagement in social situations, depending on their perceived danger or comfort. The sympathetic system activates the body's readiness for defensive action, functioning like an accelerator. When put into motion, it raises blood pressure, increases pulse and breathing rates, and tenses muscles. It is what we term the fight-flight mechanism of the body. By contrast, the parasympathetic system acts as the brakes, slowing and calming the body by decreasing blood pressure, slowing heart and breathing rates, and relaxing the body muscles. These bioinfrastructures are not restricted to brain cells or networks of cells. They also include hormones that circulate throughout the body to chemically regulate and connect disparate areas of the body. Some of the better known include gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, the chief inhibitory neurotransmitter, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, neurotransmitters that affect mood, and the stress hormones, including cortisol, a hormone that biochemically regulates the human stress response. Each of these systems has a specific neural circuitry or biochemical route that connects different parts of the brain and body. One system of particular interest to researchers in the last 10 years is that of mirror neurons, which leads to mimicry. Virtually all intentional human behavior is ultimately mimicked. When we learn how to hold a fork or express a look of surprise, mimicry is involved. The mirror neurons fire when we witness another human undertake a behavior that has distinct intention. This system prepares the identical motor neurons in our brains to fire. For instance, if I see someone pick up a cup to drink from it, my mirror neurons will fire, preparing the mirrored neurons responsible for picking up and drinking from a cup to fire. This has important implications for actions such as empathy. Empathy can be described as an action rather than merely a feeling alone, because we demonstrated empathy through non-verbal and verbal cues or actions that project the intent of connecting with another's state of mind. When a child is the subject of another's empathy, he or she will likely undergo the activation of his or her mirror neuron system related to empathy. In other words, children learn how to be empathic with others by seeing it demonstrated toward them. This mirror neuron system is one of many that are vital in regulating how we interact both within our own minds and in relationship with others. The more we understand the role of such systems, the more actively we can regulate them. For example, if I am aware that my fear is deeply connected to my breathing and heart rate, I can reduce my fear simply by consciously breathing deeply and slowly whenever I sense myself becoming fearful. For the last 3,500 years or more, people who have been truly walked with God and been known by Him have nurtured that relationship through the spiritual disciplines. We will explore several of these, along with the ways they promote greater integration within and between human brains, in more detail later. For now, it is enough to focus on 3 major streams that provide structure and support for those disciplines. In this script, Reaching Out, Henry Nouwen proposes that a healthy spiritual life includes 3 significant features, 3 legs of a stool upon which everything else rests. They include study of, especially but not limited to, the Bible, prayer, and community. I encourage you to reflect seriously on the depth of your activity in each of these 3 vital areas of living life with God. There are not requirements you must fill to make sure God is happy, nor are they the 11th commandment. Simply put, these 3 dimensions of living facilitate vital changes in the stories of those people who hunger and thirst for righteousness. This can include you. Among other things, they will strengthen your ability to pay attention to what you are intending to do. No one rightly points out that if any one of the three legs is missing, the stool will not long stand. Consequently, as we progress, I invite you to consider the place each of these holds for you. If you sense that any of them seems to be absent or has fallen by the wayside, do not judge or condemn yourself. Simply begin where you are and consider taking a small step to re-engage yourself with that area.